'cause you can't, you won't, and you don't stop. Or when you can't, you won't, and you don't stop.
The final area that we're dealing with is vicarious liability. So that's where one party is liable for the conduct of another party. Whereas agency was dealing with the ability to bind someone contractually and make them liable contractually, this has to deal with conduct that could be, say, carelessness and negligence, I think is a great example where vicarious liability comes into play. So we're going to briefly give an insight into this area without going into a lot of detail, just to make us aware that when we have this relationship between two parties, often employer-employee, vicarious liability comes into play. So whereas agency law sets out when it's possible to be contractually liable, it's possible at law for people to be held liable for harm caused by someone else, and that's vicarious liability, liability for the conduct of someone else. Most of the time, it arises in an employer-employee relationship. Although what an employer-employee relationship is not as straightforward as what you might think. So this idea of employer-employee relationship is a very complex one at law because it can vary by the area of law that we're worried about. A specific piece of legislation might define what an employer-employee relationship is. And that may go far beyond the traditional approach or the traditional view of what we have might be a full-time employee or even a part-time employee-employer relationship. This is becoming a bit more of a problem or a bit more of an area that's not as clear with the rise of technology that allows for these emerging relationships. So think of rideshare services like Uber and Ola, right? In those situations, in one sense, the people driving the cars are considered a contractor, not an employee. But that's caused a lot of problems, right? And people have been arguing that they actually are employees when we look at many of the elements of the relationship between them. So I don't want to get into whether they are employees or whether they're contractors, but I would point out that it's probably likely that it might vary under different areas of the law or different pieces of legislation. So the main topic that we're going to deal with in terms of this employer-employee relationship is what do we do when the two parties say that maybe they're not employer-employee, they're a contractor. So if you say you're a contractor, does that mean that that if you say you have a contractor, you employ a contractor, does that mean you're not vicariously liable for them? And the answer is no, because under certain conditions, the law for vicarious liability will treat them as though they are traditional employees. What's really going on here is the courts are trying to work out how much control the person in charge, the delegator, has over the other party doing the work, right? Because the more control they have, the more responsible they should be for what they do. So when they're looking at the kind of relationship, they maybe don't look at strictly what the contract between the parties say, but they look for this control. And if this control has those elements of a traditional employer-employee relationship, then that's what the law says it is, irrespective of what the parties say. And Hollis and Vabu is a great case for that. So in Hollis and Vabu, what we had was a bicycle courier, and the bicycle courier was considered a contractor of the courier company. And one of the bicycle couriers hit a pedestrian when they were delivering some documents, and they sped off. So the pedestrian never actually saw who hit them. All they could see was the uniform of the courier company. And so they sued the courier company, right, for being injured under negligence. But the courier company said, hang on, the bicycle couriers are contractors, not employees, so we're not liable for what they do. The courts, however, found otherwise, and they actually said that no matter what the contract between the parties said, the bicycle couriers were in fact employees. Why? Well, what we look at is the amount of control, right? The amount of control the defendant exercises, or the person who's supposed to be in charge, the employer? How much control do they exercise? Do they determine how you do the work? For instance, in the case of the bicycle couriers, what route you take, how you should talk to people and interact with the customers. Does the contractor have an ability to reject or accept work or not? Or do you have to take the work? And in this case, they actually had to take the work. Do you have to present yourself a certain way, wear a uniform or livery, as the court said, right? So the more control you have, the more the employer determines how you do the work, gives you the roster, tells you when to turn up, makes you dress a certain way. Okay, in that case, it's actually an employer-employee relationship. And that's what they found here, despite it being termed a contract relationship. Now, once we have this employer-employee relationship, does that mean that you're responsible for everything they do? No, of course it doesn't. But what's the limit? And this is where it can get a little bit tricky. Employers are responsible for the authorised work of an employee, but not unauthorised work. Okay, so what does that mean? That means that the employer is responsible for what you would normally do in your job, what you're authorised to do, even if you do it the wrong way. Okay, so they're responsible for authorised work even if it's done in an unauthorised manner. And that's exactly what happened in Century Insurance and Northern Ireland Road Transport. What you had was a truck driver, a petrol tank driver, who was unloading their load, their petrol, in a petrol station. And guess what they decided to do as they were unloading? They decided to have a cigarette. And it didn't end well, let's just say that. Now, of course it was against the rules. Of course it was the driver was unauthorised in having a cigarette as they're unloading. But unloading a petrol tanker is authorised work. So therefore, the employer was responsible, right? They were doing authorised work, unloading the petrol in an unauthorised manner. You're liable, right? The employer is liable. What they're not liable for is unauthorised work. And Deaton's and Flew is an example of that. Oh yeah, it is. It's right on the border, but it's an example of that. So in that case, what you had was there was a barmaid and there was a patron at the pub who she wasn't getting on well with, so decides to throw a glass of beer over the patron to settle them down, as you do. And the glass accidentally slips out of her hand, hits the patron and glasses them. So the patron then takes the hotel to court saying, well, your employee was negligent and hit me. And the employer said, well, actually, they're not authorised to throw beer on you. They're authorised to serve you beer. Right? So what they were doing was unauthorised. And in a sense, that's true, right? Because when you think about it, at hotels or clubs, they'll have security who is there to look after unruly patrons. And they will have the servers who are like serving drinks, right? They're two different jobs. So a server isn't authorised to do crowd control, which is what the barmaid was doing. So what the barmaid did was unauthorised. Okay, so that's an example of unauthorised work, and it shows that the employer is not always liable for what the employee does. Well, so there we have it, working for another. We've got those key areas of agency law, which deals with contract, and vicarious liability, which is when you're liable for the conduct of someone else. After all of that, next week we move on and thinking about how you can work together in a different way through the structure of the actual organisation that you choose when you're in business in the next module.